There comes a moment in every life when the noise of the world grows too loud, when the constant chasing, the endless expectations, and the unspoken loneliness begin to weigh heavier than we ever thought possible. Maybe it's a restless night, maybe it's a quiet walk alone, or maybe it's in the middle of a crowded room where you suddenly realize you feel utterly invisible. And in that moment, a question, ancient as time itself, rises from the silence. Is this all there is? We search for answers in every place we've been told to look. In books, in relationships, in money, in fleeting pleasures and temporary escapes. But nothing seems to fill that quiet ache inside. And then, almost by accident, you stumble upon something, a word, a phrase, a teaching about mindfulness, about inner peace, about detachment and compassion, and you wonder, is this Buddhism? Do I have to become a Buddhist to practice this? To find peace? To quiet my mind? To stop this endless suffering? It's a question millions have carried, a question that lives in the heart of every seeker. Because whether you were raised in a church, a mosque, a temple, or with no religion at all, there comes a point when you ask, is peace only for the religious? Or is it something far older, far deeper, and far more universal? In this journey, we're going to explore that question together, not through dogma, not through blind belief, but through story, through wisdom passed down across centuries, and through a deeper understanding of what Buddhism truly is and what it isn't. So before you decide what you believe, before you label yourself or reject anything outright, I invite you to simply listen. Not as a Buddhist, not as a Christian, a Muslim, a Hindu, an atheist, or a skeptic, but as a human being. Because the path to peace doesn't care about your title, it only cares about your heart. So, what is Buddhism, really? Is it a religion, a philosophy, a way of life, or maybe something else entirely? Most people, when they hear the word Buddhism, imagine monks in orange robes, ancient temples shrouded in mist, chanting in languages they don't understand. And while those images belong to the tradition, Buddhism itself is something much simpler and much more profound. Let's begin here. Buddhism isn't about worshiping a god. In fact, in its original form, it doesn't even require belief in one. You see, when Siddhartha Gautama, the man we now call the Buddha, left his royal palace 2,500 years ago, he wasn't searching for heaven. He wasn't chasing after a divine being. He was chasing a single question. Why do we suffer? Why does a child die before their time? Why does love turn into heartbreak? Why does happiness fade like a passing cloud, no matter how tightly we try to hold on to it? And when he found the answer, he didn't claim to be a god. He didn't demand worship. He simply became a teacher, a guide, a mirror, reflecting the truths of life back to those who dared to look. At its core, Buddhism is a practice, a set of tools, a path you can walk, with or without a label, with or without a temple, with or without a robe. It asks no blind faith of you. It simply invites you to look, to observe, to question the nature of your thoughts, your emotions, your attachments, and to ask yourself, what happens when I stop chasing things outside myself and start understanding what's happening within? The Buddha himself said, don't believe in something just because you've heard it. Don't believe in traditions because they've been handed down for generations. Don't believe anything just because it's spoken by teachers, elders, or even scriptures. Believe only what you have tested for yourself. This isn't a religion built on commandments. It's a way of seeing, of understanding that life is filled with suffering, but that suffering isn't random. It has causes. And when you understand those causes, you can begin to let go. It's about impermanence. understanding that everything you love will one day change. And that's not a tragedy. It's the nature of existence. It's about compassion, not as a virtue, but as a survival skill. Because when you realize everyone else is suffering just like you, it's impossible not to soften. And it's about mindfulness, being awake to your life as it unfolds, not sleepwalking through it. And here's the part most people miss. You don't have to become a Buddhist to practice these things. You don't have to shave your head or recite chants or give up your job, your family, your life. You just have to begin noticing, paying attention, choosing presence over distraction, compassion over cruelty, wisdom over ignorance. And slowly, piece by piece, something inside you begins to shift. So now we know Buddhism isn't a religion in the way most people imagine it. It's not about what you call yourself. It's about how you live and what you notice. But what does that actually look like in real life? Imagine this. You wake up one morning and for the first time, you don't immediately grab your phone. You pause. You notice the warmth of the sunlight touching your skin, the quiet hum of life moving outside your window. And for just a moment, you take a deep, conscious breath, not to achieve enlightenment, not to impress anyone, but simply to be here. This is Buddhism. It's not a ceremony. It's not a ritual. It's a way of paying attention, in the way you speak, in the way you listen. The Buddha taught that the cause of suffering is craving, our relentless habit of grasping for what we want and pushing away what we don't. But what if, for a few moments a day, you stopped chasing and stopped resisting? What if you simply witnessed what's happening within you without judgment? You don't need to be a monk to do that. You don't need to sit on a mountain or chant in Sanskrit. You just need to remember, to return to yourself. It can be as simple as noticing when your mind spirals into anger, as choosing kindness over bitterness, as recognizing in a moment of fear that fear itself is just a visitor, not a permanent resident. All of these small acts of awareness are Buddhism in motion. In ancient texts, there's a story about a man who approached the Buddha and asked, "Do I need to leave my home, my family, and become a monk to follow your path?" The Buddha smiled and said, "You don't need to abandon your life. You need to abandon your ignorance." In other words, you don't have to change your clothes, your job, your name. You have to change the way you see. See your attachments, see your habits, see the impermanence of every emotion and situation you experience. Because when you realize that nothing lasts forever, not your sorrow, not your joy, not your anxiety, not your pride, something inside you begins to loosen. And in that loosening, there's freedom. Even in modern times, thousands of people around the world, in cities, offices, coffee shops, kitchens, practice Buddhism without labels. They meditate for 5 minutes between meetings. They offer compassion to strangers on the street. They learn to release their grip on outcomes they can't control. And little by little, their lives change. Not in some dramatic, cinematic way, but in quieter, subtler ways. A calmer reaction here, a softer word there, a slower breath before a difficult decision. And isn't that what we're all really looking for? Not a new identity, but a better way to be alive. By now, you've probably realized something. This isn't really about Buddhism as a religion. It's about a way of understanding life, a wisdom so timeless, so universal, that it transcends the walls of temples, the pages of ancient texts, and even the word Buddhism itself. So, what exactly did the Buddha teach? What wisdom has survived for over 2,500 years and still speaks to the restless heart of modern life? It begins with 4 simple truths, not commandments, not laws, not threats or promises, just observations. The first noble truth: life involves suffering. Now, before you turn away, hear this. It doesn't mean life is only suffering. It means that within the beauty, the love, the victories, there's also loss. There's also change. There's also heartbreak. And pretending otherwise doesn't protect us. It only blinds us. The second noble truth: the cause of suffering is craving. We suffer because we cling. We chase after what we don't have. We grip too tightly to what we do. And when life inevitably changes, because it always does, we break. But here's the hope. The third noble truth: there is a way out. We are not doomed to live in endless discontent. When we loosen our grip, when we release our endless demands for life to be exactly as we want it, something remarkable happens. Peace begins to appear in the space where struggle used to be. And finally, the fourth noble truth: there's a path you can walk. It's called the Eightfold Path. A set of principles not about belief, but about practice, right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Not right as in moral superiority, but right as in aligned with reality, aligned with wisdom, aligned with compassion. And here's where it gets interesting. You don't need to call yourself a Buddhist to live these truths. You don't need a robe or a title. You don't need to abandon your home or deny your other beliefs. Because this wisdom isn't Buddhist. It's human. It's about seeing clearly, living kindly, and being awake to this one wild, impermanent life you've been given. In ancient stories, the Buddha compared his teachings to a raft. When someone asked if they should cling to his words forever, he replied, "If you were crossing a river with a raft, would you carry it on your back once you reach the shore?" The teachings are meant to be tools, not chains. A way to reach inner freedom, not another identity to defend. By now, maybe a new question has started to form in the back of your mind. If I find wisdom here, if these teachings resonate with me, do I need to officially become a Buddhist? Do I need a title, a ritual, a formal commitment? It's a fair question. And it's one people have asked for centuries. In many traditions, religion is a gate you either walk through or you don't. You join or you're outside. You belong or you don't. But Buddhism was never meant to work that way. Even during the Buddha's lifetime, people asked him, "Must I leave my home, renounce my belongings, and declare myself a disciple to walk your path?" And time and again, the answer was the same. Walk the path that ends suffering. Whether you wear a robe or a crown, whether you live in a temple or a marketplace, what matters is how you live. In other words, the essence of Buddhism lies not in the label you carry, but in the way you carry yourself through the world. You can study the teachings, practice mindfulness, embrace compassion, and live in awareness, without ever formally declaring a religion, because these are not religious duties. They are human experiences. But there is a time when taking formal refuge in Buddhism might matter. And it's not about belonging to a group. It's not about identity. It's about intention. If, deep in your heart, you reach a point where you feel called to make a conscious public commitment to living by certain principles, to remind yourself and the world around you of your intention to live with wisdom, with kindness, with presence, then taking formal refuge might be meaningful. Not because it changes your status in the eyes of the universe, but because it marks a promise to yourself, a promise that says, "I choose to walk this path with open eyes. I choose to seek understanding over ignorance. I choose to meet my suffering with courage and the suffering of others with compassion." And if you never take that formal step, that's okay too. The Buddha himself said, "Be a lamp unto yourself," meaning, let your life be the proof of what you've learned, not your title, not your affiliation, not your rituals. In truth, there's no gatekeeper in Buddhism, no one to decide whether you're in or out, no ceremony that makes you more worthy, and no label that makes you less. What matters is your heart, your practice, the way you choose to be with yourself and with the world. So when is it necessary to officially follow Buddhism? The honest answer is, it's never necessary, but it might one day be meaningful when you decide it is. And even then, the real journey won't happen in temples or under titles. It will happen in quiet moments of honesty, in the way you meet anger, in the way you hold sorrow, in the way you soften toward the world and toward yourself. As we've traveled this path together, you may have noticed something beautiful. Buddhism doesn't ask you to be anyone other than who you are. It doesn't demand a title. It doesn't ask for perfection, and it never turns anyone away. In a world so often divided by labels, by us and them, by believers and non-believers, Buddhism quietly whispers, "Come as you are." Whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, or none of these. Whether you pray in a church, a mosque, a temple, or simply under the open sky. Whether you believe in gods, in spirits, or in nothing at all, you are welcome. Because at its heart, Buddhism is not a faith of exclusion. It's a way of seeing, a way of being awake in a world so often asleep. And the beautiful thing is, this wisdom doesn't belong to any one group. It belongs to life itself. In ancient times, when people came to the Buddha, kings and beggars, priests and outcasts, men and women, the faithful and the skeptical, he did not ask them what they believed. He asked them what they suffered, what they longed for, and whether they wished to find peace within themselves. And to each one he offered the same wisdom. Not because they were Buddhist, but because they were human. And here's the truth, few people say out loud. You can carry this wisdom alongside whatever you already hold dear. You don't have to leave your faith to embrace awareness. You don't have to abandon your traditions to practice compassion. You don't have to reject your beliefs to learn how to be present, to suffer less, to love more openly. In fact, true wisdom strengthens whatever is good within you. I've known Catholics who meditate, Muslims who chant mantras, atheists who practice loving kindness, and Christians who study the Four Noble Truths alongside the Sermon on the Mount. And none of them felt less connected to their roots. If anything, they felt more alive, more open, more compassionate, not despite this wisdom, but because of it. The Buddha once said, "Just as the great oceans have but one taste, the taste of salt, so too do my teachings have but one taste, the taste of freedom. And that freedom is for anyone who seeks it." So if you've ever felt you didn't belong, if you've ever been told you were too different, too skeptical, too broken, too complicated, if you've ever wondered whether wisdom like this was meant for someone like you, hear this now. It was, it is, and it always will be. You don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to believe a certain thing. You don't have to be perfect or peaceful or endlessly patient. You only have to be willing to pause, to look inward, to meet your own heart, honestly, and to walk this path one breath at a time. So here we are, at the end of this journey together. The question that brought you here: do you need to follow a religion to practice Buddhism? It's not a question with a simple answer, because this journey, this path, is as unique as you are. Some may choose to step into the formal traditions, to take refuge, to join a sangha, to wear the robes. Others may walk quietly, carrying these teachings in their hearts, without labels, without ceremonies, but with deep intention, And both paths are valid. Both paths are worthy. What matters most is that you walk your path with honesty, with openness, with kindness, to yourself and to the world. Because Buddhism, at its core, is not about dogma or rules. It's about awakening, about seeing clearly, about living fully. You don't have to change who you are. You don't have to leave behind your past. You don't even have to believe it all right now. You only need to be willing to explore, to question, to sit with your doubts and your hopes, and to take each step with awareness. This is your journey, your choice, and no one else's. And wherever it takes you, may you find peace, may you find wisdom, and may you find the freedom to be truly yourself. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Until next time, may you be well, may you be happy, and may you be free.